want to tell you a few things about Mark Gordon, about Yoel Roth, about the subject of tonight's talk, and then we'll begin. Mark Gordon is a very generous and philanthropic alum of the university. Next year he'll be celebrating his 50th reunion year, and he and his partner have given quite a bit of money to the LGBT Center. That included the naming opportunity of the student lounge on the east end of the ground floor. And one of Mark's earliest gifts to the center was for an annual lecture, the only specification being that it should be a topic that is of interest to the LGBT community. And there have been many distinguished Gordon lectures. Chris Bartlett, who is now the executive director of the William Way LGBT Community Center in Philadelphia, gave the inaugural Mark Gordon lecture. Last year's lecture, which I totally enjoyed, was by Phil Tiemeyer, who's a history faculty member at Philadelphia University, and his talk was called Plain, P-L-A-N-E, Plain Queer, which was based on his research on male flight attendants, many of whom were gay, and who actually brought suit in the Supreme Court, all the way to the Supreme Court, a sex discrimination suit, because there were passengers on United Airlines that did not want male flight attendants giving them blankets or pillows or tucking them into their seats. So it was kind of sex discrimination. It was also sexual orientation discrimination. So it's a fascinating topic. There's a book that Phil published based on it that has a picture of a flight attendant wearing a kind of kilt-like skirt. So Mark lives in Fort Lauderdale, and I don't think has ever been able to make a Gordon lecture, but he's here in spirit. He's seen the flyer. He'll want to know about it. So Yoel Roth, who is tonight's lecturer, is going to be talking about Grindr and privacy and intimacy and social media. I was approached over the last several months by a number of students, male students, who shared with me in the privacy of my office their very mixed feelings about Grindr and Scruff and OkCupid and whatever other apps there are or sites. On the one hand, they felt they really needed to be there, that they didn't feel they had much choice, that that was sort of the primary way that they could meet other men in the city and on the Penn campus in particular. But that at the same time they had significant misgivings about being on these sites. And even a couple of them used this very word, shame, that they felt shame at being on Grindr or on Scruff or any of those sites. And that got me to thinking a lot about it, and I decided that having the Gordon lecture for this year focus on Grindr and other social media was very appropriate. And I was helped by Kevin, who's recording this, and directed to Yoel, who I subsequently heard speak briefly at the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Conference. So I'm very pleased that Yoel agreed to give the 2014 Mark Gordon lecture. Yoel was an undergraduate at Swarthmore. He is currently a PhD student, a doctoral student at the Annenberg School for Communication at Penn. His research has been about a number of topics, which have included the bear community and obviously social media, including Grindr. He's become something of an expert on the subject. So I found out from Yoel that 0 feet away is the tagline for Grindr, something I never knew. And so the talk is entitled 0 Feet Away, question mark, Intimacy, Privacy and Intimacy in the Age of Grindr. it gives me great pleasure to introduce Yoel Roth.
Thanks, Bob. It's sort of a tough act to follow, flight attendants in kilts, but I'm gonna do my best. Tonight I'm going to be talking, as Bob mentioned, about Grindr. I'm going to talk about what it is and how it works and why it's important for us to be thinking about it. And I'm also going to be talking a lot about the places where I think Grindr falls short, why those shortcomings are worrisome, and a little bit more about what I think we can do about them. But before I do any of that, I'm going to take advantage of one of the perks of studying pop culture and actually let a TV show do the talking for me. And so here's Kathy Griffin in a 2011 comedy special discussing Grindr.
So anyway, there is an app that I know I'm a little late to this party, but if straight women could figure this out, it would be so great, which is, there's an app where you go, and I'm not a paid spokesperson, it's Grindr, and what it is whatever, oh, there's a guy on it right now. Okay, what a shock, what a shock. So it's an app, and I think the way it works is you go on there and you say like where you are and what you're looking for. So all the other gays on Grindr know you're right there, and you're looking for love or a hand job. So yes. So I am obsessed with this. So I know this is kind of wrong, but I actually made up a fake Grindr profile. I'm not going to say my name, but this is so sick. So what the gays do is they put foxy pictures of themselves, so you know like what the guy looks like that you're talking to, and then you know exactly where they are. So you're like, hi, I would like a hand job. And then you're talking to Kyle, who's 342 feet away. Like, they tell you exactly where available gays are for whatever you want. I know. Why didn't we think of this, girls? Okay, so I decided just for fun to do a fake profile. So obviously I can't put a picture of myself up there because I'm a chick, but okay, so I have this picture of me with New Kids on the Block. So I have a shirtless picture with Donnie Wahlberg, who's hot, by the way. Don't be hating, he's hot. All right, so on my Grindr profile, it's a picture of Donnie Wahlberg without his head, because it's funny to me that the gays on Grindr don't give a shit about like your head. So there's all these like headless, awesome ab pictures. And just for fun, I sent out like a message to whatever gays were on Grindr nearby, thinking they thought I was Donnie Wahlberg from here to here. And I just said, hey, anybody feel like putting a light bulb up my ass? Because I thought nobody would respond, and I would just show my friends, oh, no, I got a ton of responses that were like, where are you at? What's your room number? It's my new favorite hobby. So I then went on the website, and I saw that Grindr actually has rules and regulations for the kind of pictures you can post, and I brought it for you. Can I read it to you? These are the Grindr guidelines. No grabbing or holding genitals. So you gotta just let them like hang there. You gotta just pick a side, right or left. All right. No images that display semen. That's fair. No photos that contain sex toys or props, including fruits or veggies. I just like that it's veggies, like it's a, freaking, crudité platter of cocks. And then this is what I love. No nudity used to advertise services, goods, events, websites, or apps. Like there's gays that just have a boner and then advertise their website on their hard cock.
So I guess Kathy Griffin has hit on all of the most important bits of my talk, but if you decide to stick around, I'm going to map out a little bit for you what we're going to be talking about that goes into a little bit more depth. So first I'm going to give you some more detail about Grindr and its users and ask, I think, the important question, what is Grindr for anyway? I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can and can't include in a Grindr profile, which I think has some pretty significant stakes for how gay self-expression works online. Finally, I'm going to share some anecdotes and provocations about what we can share on Grindr and what I think that suggests about online privacy. And then I'm hoping that we're going to have time for sort of an open discussion and some Q&A where we can maybe hash out some of the open issues that I'm going to present in tonight's talk. So I think the first question to ask is, why should we be paying attention to Grindr at all? What makes this app significant in the universe of every other possible app or social networking service? And so the first, I think, obvious answer is numbers. Grindr is the most popular gay social networking service, and it's one of the most successful dating services, gay or straight, out there. As of July 2013, they had 7 million users in 192 countries, and they say that they're getting about 10,000 new users per day. So Grindr is growing, and it's pretty significant. But I actually want to dwell on that number of 7 million for just a minute so we can get a sense for the scale of it. So last fall, the Pew Internet Project put out a report on online dating and relationships where they said that 11% of American internet users, which is about 9% of the adult population, have used an online dating site. So that's about 21 million Americans. But the Pew report had some problems with it, most significantly of which was that it doesn't differentiate between straight and gay people. The word gay appears in the 57-page report only once, and Grindr is also only mentioned once, and here's why I think that's an issue. In 2011, about 3.8% of the American adult population identified as LGBT, of which 1.7% were gay or lesbian and 1.8% were bisexual. More precise figures aren't available, so as sort of an approximation, this is like my back of the envelope math, let's cut the figure in half to only consider men who have sex with men. And so that leaves us with, again, as a rough figure, about 1.9% of the American adult population, or about 4.5 million people. And Grindr says they have just shy of 3 million active users in the United States. So that means that about 2/3 of American gay men are on Grindr, and that's huge. Let's assume that my back of the envelope math is completely wrong, which I'm willing to accept, and arbitrarily cut the figure in half and say that conservatively 1/3 of American gay men are or have been on Grindr. That 33% is still leaps and bounds beyond the 9% figure that Pew published. And those users are extremely engaged. They exchange about 30 million text messages and 2 million photos per day. And we're going to talk a lot about those 2 million photos in just a bit. And since Grindr's release, a slew of similar apps have emerged, including Scruff, Growler, Mister, Jacked, Hornet, and so on. Some of these apps target more specific populations of users. Growler, I learned their slogan today and I'm really into it. It's more bears in more places. And it generally has an audience that's older, larger, and hairier than that of Grindr. But in each case, these apps are all borrowing directly from the same concept that was pioneered first by Grindr in 2009. And the broader point here is that meeting online has had a dramatic impact on gay sociability. Grindr, of course, wasn't the first to do this. There were LGBT-specific Usenet groups and bulletin board systems from the late 80s onward, and there were and still are a huge array of gay chat rooms on Internet Relay Chat. And of course, there were other early gay-targeted social networking platforms, things like Manhunt, Adam for Adam, Gay.com, and XY, some of which are still around today. But since its launch in 2009, Grindr has had an enormous impact, making it both faster and easier to meet gay men online. And crucially, Grindr made this process both local and mobile, and its popularity reflects that these developments have really resonated with its users. As a 2012 study of same-sex couples put it, and I quote, "Meeting online has not only become the predominant way that same-sex couples meet in the United States, but meeting online is now dramatically more common among same-sex couples than any way of meeting has ever been for heterosexual or same-sex couples in the past." And there's both a positive and a negative spin to this. On one hand, it's easier than ever before to find queer people or queer communities wherever you are in the world. But it raises some important questions about what apps like Grindr are doing to the traditional sites of gay social life. Will Grindr, as some people have predicted, bring about the death of the gay bar? That remains to be seen. But all of this really begs the question, what are these users actually using Grindr for? And so let's start with how Grindr describes itself on its website. They call themselves the world's biggest mobile network of guys. So this tells us a couple of things. First, that it's mobile. Second, that it's a social network. Third, that it has men on it, but we don't get too much else from there. They then elaborate by saying you'll always find a new date, buddy, or friend on Grindr. So we now have 3 potential use cases for Grindr. You can find a date, a buddy, whatever that means, or a friend. Friends are important. Grindr's CEO then elaborates that the beauty of Grindr is that you find a lot of things you didn't even know you were looking for. And this is really leaving the app completely open. Grindr is a service that connects people, and the outcomes of that connection can vary pretty much infinitely. And you don't even know what they are until you find them, so that's awesome. But then the app itself actually makes a number of categories available to its users where they can select what it is that they're looking for in their interactions with others. So you have chat, dates, friends, networking, a relationship, and then the intentionally ambiguous right now. And nobody ever says what that means, but you can probably figure it out. But is that list of options completely disingenuous? Is Grindr all about the right now, so the hookup, and everything else is just a prudish coat of paint trying to make things look a little more on the up and up? To take one example from a truly wide range of journalists and bloggers who have asked this question, a columnist in G Philly last year tried to use Grindr for, quote, networking, and chronicled some of his adventures. He asks, like Carrie Bradshaw before me, I couldn't help but wonder, could I really network on Grindr? The author then proceeds to tell stories of his experiences meeting people for, quote, networking, people he calls Grindr studs numbers 1 and 2, and both of his networking opportunities were total failures, at least in the sense that the author was subsequently invited to hook up with his studs in addition to the professional networking he was looking for. But he concludes on an optimistic note. Here's my verdict. If you can sort through the sea of dick pics and ASL, age, sex, location, comments, you'll notice connections that are far more lucrative than they are lubricated. I'm not sure what that means. And if you're anything like me, you may just find a different kind of opportunity than you were expecting. Grindr is far from being the gay LinkedIn, he writes, but for now, it'll do. Despite this optimistic closing, the article is pretty deterministic in its take on Grindr. It even begins by describing Grindr as, quote, the sex app that gay men can't help firing up, a sentence that both assumes Grindr is for sex, the question that he's ostensibly asking, and makes that sex somehow seem both compulsive and pathological. We can't help but use Grindr to hook up. It's in our nature. But there's really a more general take, and it's one that's encapsulated in the service's slogan, and that is 0 feet away. 0 feet away isn't just a cute slogan we print on our t-shirts, notes the Grindr website. It's a state of mind, a way of life. I'm not sure what that means, but the website then continues, turning Grindr off and being there in person with that guy you were chatting with is the final goal of using the app. So finally we have some detail. Being there in person can still mean almost anything, from hooking up to making a new professional contact to getting restaurant recommendations. Grindr's developers are quite purposive in representing the app in as open a manner as possible. The service is what its users make of it, they consistently stress. Now, this isn't me trying to sanitize Grindr or diminish the reality that a lot of people do use the service to find casual sex. Instead, I want to stress that very little about the Grindr software itself or how it's marketed says, this is for hookups. If that's how people use it, that's about people, and it's not about Grindr. I'm stressing this point because even as Grindr has become increasingly mainstream, with a huge number of users and cameo appearances on shows like Girls, we still seem to be dealing with a huge amount of shame around using it. This shame seems to be particularly pronounced on college campuses. There's a whole genre of articles that appear in student newspapers, including the Harvard Crimson, Oxford's Sherwell, and the DP here at Penn, to name a few, that almost invariably are published anonymously or quote pseudonymous sources talking about their clandestine Grindr-enabled hookups. An article published by my alma mater student paper, the Swarthmore Phoenix, epitomizes the paradox here. Even as many of the students interviewed using fake names say that about a quarter of gay or bisexual men at Swarthmore are on Grindr, they're reluctant to admit that they're part of that quarter. A professor interviewed in the article about his experiences with Grindr insisted on being referred to as Professor X because, and I'm quoting here, of the sensitive nature of the article. There are real questions to be asked here, I think, on a number of different levels. For example, what happens when faculty and students occupy the same social networking space on a campus environment? Where do you draw the line between appropriate and inappropriate conduct? If you're a professor up for tenure, is being on a dating site somehow discrediting, or should it be? But we shouldn't be misdirecting these questions onto Grindr as somehow exceptional. Notably, none of the many professors I've seen interviewed about their interactions with students on Facebook chose to be anonymous in doing so. We're assuming that there's something scandalous or discrediting about Grindr, and by doing so, we're complicit in both making it both scandalous and discrediting. The reality is Grindr goes to great lengths to make itself unscandalous, to the point where for all of the discussions about hooking up and dick pics, it's important to ask what's missing. And the answer is usually dick pics. I want to go into a little bit more depth about the profile guidelines that Kathy Griffin was talking about. The Grindr profile guidelines state simply that users are not permitted to post sexually explicit, revealing, or overly suggestive photos of any kind. The rules then continue on to ban visible undergarments, hip bones, bodily fluids, or, quote, any sexually suggestive objects. So that's the fruits or veggies rule. Grindr also, and this is important, manually reviews every photo that's submitted to it. They're very tight-lipped about what this review process actually looks like, but if it's anything like the process at Manhunt, which is another service that reviews photos manually, there's a room full of people who spend all day, every day, looking at the photos that men submit of themselves and decide one by one which are okay and which aren't. What's even more interesting is that in the case of Manhunt, a majority of their photo reviewers are heterosexual men and women, which raises some, I think, interesting questions about who actually makes the call about what gay men are allowed to share about themselves online. This is by no means an issue that's specific to gay social networking. Almost every social networking service has some type of policy about what its users may or may not do. Facebook, for example, has a 10-point list of what they call their community standards that in broad terms outline what's allowed in user-generated content. Violence and porn, for example, are out. Breastfeeding mothers, and these rules get even more complicated as services move internationally. Do you tailor your rules to the laws of the most restrictive country, to the United States, or somewhere in between? These are questions that are still being worked out by Facebook and also by Grindr. But the bigger question here is, where did these rules actually come from? And the answer ultimately is complicated, but I want to suggest two options. The first explanation is maybe the most straightforward. These rules came from the people who wrote them, service providers and software developers. So if Grindr bans suggestive fruits and veggies, it's because its developers think those fruits and veggies are genuinely disruptive to how Grindr as a social networking service works. Content management policies are a normative articulation of what a service's developers want their product to look like. This assumes a level of agency on the part of developers, that they're free to make exactly the product they want. Some of this was borne out in an interview I conducted with Grindr's CEO. He suggested that some of the viability of Grindr emerges from the fact that it keeps erotic images hidden from view. Quote, we didn't want our users to experience logging into Grindr and instantly seeing unexpected or unwanted nudity. Oh my God, it's a penis. We wanted Grindr to be inclusive. A lot of the services that came before Grindr were more overt, and we think that narrowed the appeal and the experience of using those services. But that isn't necessarily the explanation that's usually offered by Grindr for its policies. Instead, most of the service's support documents, as well as nearly all press coverage of the service, focus on the restrictions that are imposed by Apple and Google as part of the app distribution process. Developers who want to distribute applications through the Apple App Store or Google Play have to follow rules that are outlined by Apple and Google. And these are some of Apple's rules for apps distributed on the App Store. We view apps it should be differently, I think, than books or songs, which we do not curate. If you want to criticize a religion, write a book. If you want to describe sex, write a book or a song, or create a medical app. It can get complicated, but we've decided not to allow certain kinds of content in the App Store. We will reject apps for any content or behavior that we believe is over the line. What line, you ask? Well, as a Supreme Court justice once said, I'll know it when I see it. And we think you will also know it when you cross it. Admittedly, these policies are quite vague, but it's worth noting that having read the policies pretty closely, nowhere in the Apple or Google developer guidelines was I able to find a rule that says applications can't show photos with visible pubic hair or sexually suggestive fruits and veggies. So where did this rule actually come from? According to Grindr's CEO, it came from Apple. He emphasized to me the vagueness of the developer guidelines, which is true, but he downplayed the process of design taking place within Grindr that's actually behind them. This reframes the discussion in an important way. Instead of saying, we came up with these rules and we're imposing them on our users, he suggested Apple came up with the rules and we're doing the best job that we can in interpreting them for our users. Coming back to the earlier quote, despite the fact that all of Grindr's documentation focuses on the externally imposed nature of these restrictions, Grindr's developers clearly have opinions about what their service should look like that are manifested in their content policies. But those opinions are very seldom disclosed. So that's pretty much the second explanation, that Grindr is obeying laws set out by companies like Apple and Google that put a limit on how much skin you can show in a profile photo. The problem is that even as both internal choices and external rules play a part in shaping what services like Grindr look like, we overwhelmingly, as users and the public, place the responsibility with Apple and Google. A significant number of gay blogs have referred to these policies as, quote, puritanical or prudish, but most cite Apple as the reason for their existence. As the blog Queerty put it, software makers revise their guidelines all the time, but nobody tightens the rules faster than developers subject to Apple's increasingly stringent rules about what can be sold in its iPhone App Store. Grindr has, because of the App Store's existing rules, never allowed members to display naked photos in their main profile pictures, but updated rules go much further. Basically, the most risque you can go is board shorts, no Speedos. It's worth noting that in 2010, when Grindr revised and tightened its restrictions on user-generated content, neither Apple nor Google had substantially modified their policies on content in third-party applications. Most observers, including this blog, simply assumed they had, and Grindr's developers did nothing to dispel that assumption. But why is that actually a problem? Why does it matter if we're blaming Apple and Google instead of focusing our attention on Grindr? By shifting the burden for these restrictions onto technological constraints like Apple's rules for the App Store, we forget that the process that results in the formulation of these constraints is normative, that there's a humanness at the heart of the technical process of running a social networking service. We forget that we're dealing with the creations of people rather than the outcomes of technical systems. Norms and values are open for debate. Technical processes, generally speaking, are not. So why bother trying to argue against them at all? This mentality has important consequences for users' ability to disagree. Some of this can help account for the seeming paradox of a growing and highly engaged user base on Grindr, even as the app has consistently low reviews on the App Store, many of which focus on the service's content policies. Users recognize the problem, but they don't hold Grindr accountable for it. They keep using the app even as they give it a 1-star rating. And so these complaints have been pretty toothless so far. Even if we don't recognize it, part of our power as users is to do more than just write negative reviews. By virtue of being privately funded, Grindr's commercial viability depends on showing its advertisers that it can maintain and grow a large base of users. If those users start leaving, Grindr could be faced with a problem, and one which requires it to start taking its users' opinions of things like its content policy a little bit more seriously. I want to close by posing a few questions about how services like Grindr fit into our lives, and why we might feel so anxious about using them. Grindr's slogan is 0 feet away. It's all about using the online to connect people offline in the, quote, real world. But that process can sometimes have unintended consequences, when what happens on Grindr doesn't stay where we expect it to. And so let's start with the website Douchebags of Grindr, which is pretty much what it says on the label. It's a catalog of douchebags on Grindr. These examples are all taken from posts in the last 2 weeks, and the archives go back to 2011. And to be clear, I was the one who blocked out the faces and usernames, not the website itself. They say things like, no fats, femmes, olds, uglies, or ethnics. Young professionals and recent college grads don't impress me. Or, I'm a gay guy. If I wanted to date someone feminine, I would be straight and with a girl. All right, that's not especially nice. Or squinty eye, no reply. Or not attracted to HIV-positive guys, Muslims, or Jews. No stalkers or anyone with a mental disability either. As the website, I think, very reasonably points out, there are some real concerns that Grindr users have about the norms of intercultural sensitivity on the service. No fats, femmes, no Asians, no HIV-positive guys, no Jews, no Muslims, no hairy guys. The list of potential prejudices is long. And actually, there's filters built right into the Grindr app to make some of those preferences as easy as possible for you to implement. Don't want to see any fat guys? No problem, you don't have to. Grindr lets it happen. But I actually want to focus on something a little bit different here. The point here isn't to adjudicate whether or not these guys are actually douchebags, even though they probably are. Instead, I'm interested in the politics of taking a screenshot of somebody else's Grindr profile, removing it from that context, and sharing it publicly on a website. And the douchebags of Grindr aren't the only ones. Another website, calling itself Totem and Taboo, collects screenshots of Grindr profiles that feature photos taken at the Berlin Holocaust Memorial. The cultural politics of these images are an open and interesting question, but even with this, we're faced with the same basic concern. What happens on Grindr very rarely stays on Grindr. And this is by design. Grindr prides itself on how easy it makes it to meet somebody else face to face. And part of that is through disclosing information about yourself that enables others to easily and quickly figure out if they are or are not interested in you. But a consequence of all that sharing is that you lose control over where your personal information goes once it leaves your phone. To take an example from an article published anonymously on 34th Street a few months ago, a Penn student writing about his experiences on Grindr says he was chatting with another user when that guy sent him an oddly familiar photo of the author's ex-boyfriend's penis. Why was the author's ex-boyfriend's penis circulating freely on Grindr? Who knows? But my hunch is the owner of said penis didn't agree to let that happen. Revenge porn is an even more severe instantiation of this loss of control over images of your body. Let's take another potentially more serious example. Someone writing into Dan Savage's Savage Love advice column reported that a friend of his who identifies as straight, but doesn't really act it, is in fact on Grindr chatting and swapping pics. Should we say something, the reader asks? Would letting him know he's been outed be the best course of action? Note the phrase that he's been outed. The outing has already happened, and being on Grindr was what did it. For anyone who's familiar with Dan Savage's stance on outing, his response was pretty typical. Chad hasn't been outed, Dan says. Chad outed himself. Being on Grindr, Savage argues, is the same thing as going to a gay bar. And if you see a closeted acquaintance at a gay bar, presto, they just came out. And it's okay to confront them with their sexuality. And it's more than okay, says Dan. You have a responsibility to tell them that they are officially out of the closet. I don't think we need to look too far beyond the suicide of Tyler Clementi to understand why this kind of confrontation could be deeply problematic. Even if we accept that someone swapping pics on Grindr is tantamount to putting their sexuality out there in public, there's still an ethical question to be answered about outing someone. Is it appropriate to out a politician who opposes LGBT rights if he's on Grindr soliciting hookups with other men? Is it appropriate if it's a college student? Larry Gross at the University of Southern California has done a lot of important work about this ethical question, but there's still open issues, and they're certainly not as cut and dry as Dan Savage's response suggests. Another more recent example from here in Philadelphia just over a week and a half ago concerned a man who invited someone to his hotel room for a Grindr hookup, then was held up at gunpoint, sexually assaulted, and robbed. These sorts of violent incidents connected to Grindr get a huge amount of press coverage, as did the Craigslist killer. The point isn't that the internet is necessarily an unsafe place, or that hooking up from Grindr necessarily means that you're more likely to get assaulted than if you hook up with somebody that you met in a bar. But we tend to see it that way. Something about services like Grindr scares us, even as we can't put them down. Whether we're talking about what pictures of yourself you can post, or about somebody being assaulted in their hotel room, or even about a catalog of people who post racist things on their profile, we keep coming back to the same key idea. Social networking services like Grindr are still in their infancy. We're still figuring out what the rules are, how best to protect ourselves, and how to get what we're looking for, whatever that might be. But we, the users, need to be more actively involved in this process. If we find Grindr prudish or puritanical because we can't post pictures in our underwear, we need to speak up about it, moving with our feet, if necessary, to services that aren't as restrictive. We also need to think critically and carefully about the data that we're sharing, and decide how much information we want circulating on Grindr, knowing that the dick pic you share with one person can in turn be shared with 100 others. And if we're going to combat the stigma around gay social networking, we need to stop publishing anonymous articles about our clandestine hookups. Or at least, we need to ask ourselves the question of why we feel the need to speak about Grindr as if it's something to be ashamed of. And I'm hoping that in our conversation tonight, we can start to work some of those questions out, figure out why we might feel ashamed, why we might feel scared, and why we find these services so endlessly fascinating. Thanks.